So when I came to the Isle of Man, I thought it would be smaller than it was. And for the first 10 years or so, I was just a pretty ordinary guy who went to work, and in the evenings I would play a bit of sport. I would, especially for a boy coming from Melbourne in Australia, I enjoyed travel a lot, going throughout Europe and so on. And it wasn't really until the whole lockdown period where, and the COVID period, where I became interested in what was happening in the policy and the politics of the community. I became interested because I fundamentally care about the community, and I saw things that the government was doing really bizarrely and poorly. And I'm a big believer in the philosophy of you can just do things. And so, for me, it's just some random schmuck living in a little apartment in Douglas. I started poking around, and so through that period I uncovered documentation and confirmation that the government had shredded a letter from a health department employee to the health minister, and then that sort of blew up in the Isle of Man and got a lot of attention. And then discovered that during the pandemic, the Isle of Man government was destroying vaccines that had been received on the Isle of Man. And third of all, that the government of the Isle of Man was stockpiling vaccines in a way that reduced how many were actually being given to people, in contravention with the medical advice of the medical experts across England, Wales, Scotland, and the chief medical officers of those institutions. And I found those three things really concerning, because I had no particular interest in any of that stuff beforehand. And I figured if I can uncover documentation that proves those three things, what else is happening in the Isle of Man government? So the Isle of Man, later in the pandemic, received a reputation. But throughout the early phases of the pandemic, the government was significantly downplaying the risk and fell into a trap of panicking very late. So, for example, the restrictions on movement and travel were a week after the UK and England. As late as March 2020, the health minister of the Isle of Man, David Ashford, was saying that the risk of COVID to the Isle of Man was medium to low, in direct contravention to what was happening, because we knew in March 2020 that there were 100,000 people at least infected. There were thousands of people dying across the world. And so repeatedly, the Isle of Man government panicked late. And so for much of the first period of the pandemic, the Isle of Man was one of the worst hit places in the world. In terms of deaths per capita, the Isle of Man was in the top 10 for the first phase of the pandemic. And then in the second phase, in May, so in early May, the health minister said that it was not possible to eradicate the pandemic from the Isle of Man. 8 days later, we eradicated the pandemic from the Isle of Man. And so throughout this thing, we repeatedly saw the misinformation, disinformation provided by the Isle of Man government, because it seemed like they just didn't know what they were doing. And so that is why, compared to other island nations, the Isle of Man had far more deaths. And so on the same day that New Zealand and Australia were closing their borders to visitors, the Chief Minister of the Isle of Man was saying, go out to the pub. And so that is for the first period. And so we're talking here about the period from March 2020 through to about May. There was a very strict lockdown. Over the 2020 and 2021 lockdown periods as a whole, something in the order of over 200 more people per capita were arrested for COVID breaches in the Isle of Man than in the UK. And also during that period, while suicide rates in the United Kingdom, the US, and other Western nations remained very flat, in the Isle of Man there was a huge spike from about 9 or 10 or 11 a year up to 24, 25. And these things all happened at the same time, and then after these restrictions were removed, it fell back into the normal range, similar to the UK or other Western developed nations. So I published the data. It was all freely available on the internet. I published the sources, I published the documents, and some of the media picked up on some of these questions, some of these issues. Some of them did not. But at the end of the day, this was a a difficult period, but I think an honest reckoning of that period reflects very badly on the decisions made by the Health Minister, and it's very sad to think about the consequences of the decisions made by the Department of Health and the Cabinet Office of the Isle of Man Government.